The 6 basic principles to the U.S. Constitution. The first basic principle of the United States Constitution is the idea of popular sovereignty or self-rule, in that leaders of our government can only govern with the consent of the people. So our congressional leaders and so those of the House of Representatives and those of the United States Senate, including people like John Klein, who is our U.S. representative, and Amy Klobuchar and Al Franken, who are our 2 representatives, or our 2 senators rather, from Minnesota, are only there because they have been elected by the consent of the people. The majority of the individuals had chosen them to rule. So popular sovereignty basically means that we will not be ruled by any form of monarchy or dictatorship or oligarchy or anything like that, because we have implemented a system that is based on popular sovereignty, where our rulers are elected to their positions. The second principle of the Constitution is the idea of limited government, and this is the idea that all government leaders, individuals who are either in the legislative branch, the executive branch, or even the judicial branch or the Supreme Court, are all subject to the law and to the Constitution. So therefore, there's nothing that you can do that's above the law. Everybody is constrained by the United States Constitution, regardless of your title or your position. The third principle of the Constitution is the idea of separation of powers. This basically means that our government is divided among 3 branches of government, and this includes the legislative, executive, and judicial. Legislative being our Senate and House of Representatives, collectively known as Congress. The executive branch being the president and his number of cabinets that work below him or her, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, the 9 members that are unelected and nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. We get some of these ideas from some other famous empires that we already know of, namely the Romans, who were the first to come up with the idea of separation of powers. They too had a Senate, but in addition they had their magistrates as well as their assemblies and censors as well. So they had a number of different branches of government. Checks and balances is the 4th feature of the United States government, and this is the idea that the legislative, executive, and judicial branches are restrained by the other branches in some way. We'll watch a video on basically the checks and balances feature and how well it actually is working today. Here is a look at some of those separation of powers and checks and balances that are utilized by the President, by Congress, and the judicial branch. Starting with the judicial branch, they have the ability of judicial review, which we'll talk about in a little bit here in the next slide. The President has a number of things that he or she can do to Congress. They can veto bills, so if they don't like a law that's passed by Congress, they can veto the legislation and therefore make it null. They can line item different bills, which means that they can take out any types of spending in bills or earmarked bills for spending, which we'll talk more about when we get to the legislative branch. He or she, being the President, can call special sessions, so Congress votes on how long their session is going to be, and at various times they will take a recess or a break for holidays and for summer break. And if something happens in the country that requires legislative action, the President can call the legislative branch back into action. The President can also recommend legislation to Congress. So a lot of people believe that Obamacare was written directly by President Obama and his cabinet. Although they did help, they are not the ones that actually put forth Obamacare. That can only be done by the Congress or by the legislative branch, so they can recommend legislation. And the President can also negotiate foreign treaties which are approved by Congress. When it comes to the judicial branch, the President can appoint federal judges. This can be Supreme Court members as well as other federal district judges, but they do have to be confirmed by Congress. And the President can also grant pardons or legal forgiveness of crimes to individuals who have committed a particular crime. This doesn't happen very often, but it will happen
In some cases, such as if somebody is found not guilty due to DNA testing that proves that they were not the killer, you can take them off of death row for that. The pardoning portion of the president's power was put in there as a catch-all in case mistakes were made. Today, pardons are usually used for forgiveness of campaign finance violations that were committed by somebody that supported the president in their campaign endeavors. Now, the legislative branch has a few powers that, or types of checks and balances that they have. They control all appropriation funds, which means that anything that deals with spending tax dollars has to go through Congress and starts in the House of Representatives. If the president vetoes a bill that they have passed, they can override that veto if they can get 2/3 of all members on board to do so, which is very difficult. Which is proven in the fact that only 4% of all presidential vetoes have ever been overridden by Congress in our history. They approve all presidential appointments. That's done specifically in the Senate. They create new agencies and programs as they see needed. Things like the TSA or the Department of Homeland Security have been created by Congress in the past to adapt to changing circumstances in the United States. They can use impeachment process to remove the president or other federal officials, which we'll talk more about in another unit. They also are there to approve treaties that are negotiated by the president. A prime example of one that was negotiated by a president but not approved would be the Treaty of Versailles and the establishment of the League of Nations after World War I. And they are the only ones that can actually declare war. So anytime the United States goes to war, this cannot be done by the president, but has to be declared officially by the legislative branch, which brings a whole host of new problems there about habeas corpus rights during war, whether war is issued by the president through words or officially by the United States Congress. And when it comes to checking the judicial branch, Congress has the ability to approve the presidential appointments of district judges and Supreme Court judges. They create a number of lower district federal courts when they are needed. They can also remove judges through impeachment, and they can propose amendments to the United States Constitution. And lastly, judicial review. It's just basically the ability of the Supreme Court to rule the acts of these two branches or the laws passed by this branch to be constitutional or not. Which brings us to the fifth principle of the Constitution. That's the same idea of judicial review, so there's a little overlap here. This is, again, the power to decide whether what government does is in accord with the Constitution. That was provided not originally in our first written Constitution, but was provided by a famous Supreme Court case in 1803, which is known as Marbury versus Madison, basically which dealt around the establishment of a national bank. And what this court case established was the power of judicial review by the Supreme Court. The last power, or rather the last principle of the Constitution, is the idea of federalism, and this is the division of powers between and among the central government and the regional governments. When we talk about central governments, we're talking about the national government, the federal government, the United States powers and rights and duties. And when we talk about regional governments, we're talking about the state powers. We're talking about local municipalities and counties. We're talking about things that are directly related to your life because they're right in your backyard. So those words can be used interchangeably when we say something along the lines of central. That can be federal, and it can also be national. That can be U.S. Regional can be state, and it can be local, and it can be municipal, and it can be things like county governments as well.